The phone call came at 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday that started like any other day. I was reviewing quarterly reports in my downtown office when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Mrs. Henderson, my 78-year-old neighbor who lived 3 houses down from us. Her voice was shaking when I answered. "Something is wrong with Sarah. She collapsed in your front yard and she is not responding to me. I think you need to get home right now." My blood turned cold. Sarah, my wife of 12 years, had been working in our garden that morning before I left for work. She mentioned feeling a little tired, but nothing that seemed serious. Now Mrs. Henderson was telling me she found her unconscious on our property. I grabbed my keys and ran from the office without saying a word to anyone. The drive home felt like an eternity, even though I broke every speed limit. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. All I could think about was getting to Sarah and making sure she was okay. When I pulled into our driveway, I saw Mrs. Henderson kneeling beside my wife near our rose garden. Sarah was lying motionless on the grass, her face pale and her breathing shallow. Her gardening gloves were still on her hands, and the small shovel she had been using lay abandoned beside her. I dropped to my knees next to her and checked for a pulse. It was there, but weak and irregular. Her skin felt cold and clammy despite the warm afternoon sun. When I called her name, she did not respond at all. Her eyes were closed and she seemed completely unaware of our presence. Mrs. Henderson explained that she had been watching from her kitchen window when she saw Sarah suddenly stop working and grab her chest. She collapsed a few seconds later and had not moved since. That was about 10 minutes before she called me. I immediately dialed 911 and explained the situation to the dispatcher. She confirmed that an ambulance was being dispatched to our address and should arrive within 8 to 10 minutes. She instructed me to keep Sarah comfortable and monitor her breathing while we waited for the paramedics. Those minutes felt like hours as I knelt beside my wife, holding her hand and talking to her even though she could not hear me. I told her that help was coming and that everything would be okay. But deep down, I was terrified that I might lose the most important person in my life. Mrs. Henderson stood nearby, wringing her hands and looking as worried as I felt. She kept apologizing for not acting sooner, but I assured her that she had done exactly the right thing by calling me immediately. As we waited, I noticed that Sarah's breathing seemed to be getting more labored. Her chest rose and fell in an irregular pattern that made my heart race with fear. I had never felt so helpless in my entire life. Then I heard the sound of sirens in the distance, getting closer to our neighborhood. Relief flooded through me as I realized that professional medical help was finally arriving. I prepared to guide the ambulance to our house so they could begin treating Sarah immediately. The ambulance turned onto our street with lights flashing and sirens blaring. I stood up and waved my arms to guide them to our driveway where Sarah was still lying unconscious on the grass. The relief I felt seeing those paramedics was overwhelming. Finally, my wife would get the medical attention she desperately needed. But as the ambulance approached our house, a silver sedan suddenly pulled out from a side street and blocked the ambulance path completely. The driver got out of the car and I immediately recognized her. It was Karen Mitchell, the president of our homeowners association board. Karen was a woman in her mid-50s who took her HOA position more seriously than most people take their actual careers. She carried a leather portfolio everywhere she went, filled with bylaws, regulations, and violation notices that she handed out like candy on Halloween. The ambulance driver honked his horn and gestured for Karen to move her vehicle, but she ignored him completely. Instead, She walked directly up to the ambulance and knocked on the driver's window with her knuckles. "Excuse me," she called out in her sharp, authoritative voice. "I need to see your permits and documentation for emergency vehicle access to this property." I could not believe what I was hearing. My wife was dying in our front yard, and this woman was talking about permits. I ran over to Karen and tried to explain the situation. "Karen, my wife collapsed, and she needs immediate medical attention. Please move your car so the paramedics can reach her." She turned to me with a cold expression and pulled out a folder from her portfolio. "I understand you think this is an emergency, but rules are rules. No unauthorized vehicles are allowed on HOA property without proper documentation." The lead paramedic got out of the ambulance and approached us. He was a middle-aged man with kind eyes who clearly dealt with difficult situations on a regular basis. "Ma'am, we have a medical emergency here. We need access to the patient immediately." Karen shook her head and pointed to a page in her folder. "According to Section 12.4 of our HOA bylaws, all emergency vehicles must have pre-approved access permits filed with the board at least 48 hours in advance. I don't see any such permit for this address." The paramedic looked at her like she had lost her mind. "Ma'am, we don't need permits to respond to 911 calls. We're here to save someone's life." "That may be true in public areas," Karen replied, "but this is private HOA property. Our regulations supersede your assumed authority. If you proceed without proper documentation, I will be forced to file legal action against both you and the homeowner." I felt my blood pressure rising as precious minutes ticked away while my wife remained unconscious. Sarah's condition could be deteriorating while we stood there arguing with this power-drunk neighbor about paperwork. "Karen, please," I begged. "She could die while we're standing here talking about permits. Can't you make an exception for a medical emergency?" Her expression did not soften at all. "Rules exist for a reason. If I make an exception for you, then everyone will expect special treatment. The integrity of our community standards depends on consistent enforcement of all regulations." The second paramedic had gotten out of the ambulance and was growing visibly frustrated. He tried a different approach with Karen. "Ma'am, federal law requires that we respond to medical emergencies. Your local bylaws cannot override federal emergency medical regulations." Karen pulled out her phone and started dialing a number. "We'll see about that. I'm calling the other board members to come witness this violation. I'm also documenting this entire incident for our legal team." I watched in horror as she made her phone calls while my wife lay motionless in our yard. The paramedics explained to me that they could not physically move her vehicle without risking legal liability for property damage. They were trapped by bureaucracy at the worst possible moment. Sarah's breathing was becoming more shallow and irregular. Time was running out, and Karen seemed determined to let her power trip continue regardless of the human cost. I realized that conventional reasoning would not work with someone this committed to flexing her authority over people's lives. The paramedics pulled me aside and explained the impossible situation we were facing. They could not legally force Karen to move her vehicle without risking assault charges and property damage lawsuits. Their hands were tied by the same legal system that was supposed to protect people in emergencies. "Sir, we want to help your wife, but if we physically move that car, we could face criminal charges and lose our jobs," the lead paramedic explained. "She technically has the right to park on this street, even if her timing is completely inappropriate." I looked back at Sarah, who had not moved or responded in over 20 minutes now. Her lips were starting to look blue around the edges, which terrified me more than anything I had ever seen. My wife was dying while we dealt with bureaucratic nonsense. Karen was now on her third phone call, summoning additional HOA board members to support her position. I could hear her explaining to someone about unauthorized emergency vehicles and the importance of maintaining community standards. She spoke about my wife's medical crisis like it was a minor inconvenience to her regulatory enforcement. Within minutes, two more cars arrived carrying other HOA board members. They parked behind Karen's vehicle, creating an even bigger blockade between the ambulance and my house. These people were actually doubling down on preventing medical care from reaching a dying woman. Several neighbors had come out of their houses to see what was happening. They stood on their porches and sidewalks, watching this surreal scene unfold. Some of them looked concerned about Sarah, but most seemed afraid to challenge Karen's authority directly. She had a reputation for making life miserable for anyone who crossed her. Old Mr. Peterson from across the street shook his head in disgust and went back inside his house. Mrs. Chen from next door looked like she wanted to say something, but ultimately stayed silent. The neighborhood had been trained to fear Karen's retaliation more than they cared about helping their neighbors. I knelt back down beside Sarah and checked her pulse again. It was getting weaker and more irregular. Her breathing was so shallow that I had to put my ear close to her mouth to hear it at all. The woman I loved was slipping away while 5 people argued about permits and parking regulations. That was the moment I realized that normal procedures had completely failed. The system that was supposed to protect us had become a weapon in the hands of someone who cared more about control than human life. Traditional help was not coming because one person had decided to weaponize bureaucracy against my family. But then I remembered something that might change everything. During my military service, I had made connections with people who worked in emergency medical transport. One of my old squad mates, Mike Torres, had gotten out of the Army and started working for a private medical helicopter company that served our region. These people operated under federal aviation rules, not local HOA regulations. They could land anywhere that was medically necessary, and no neighborhood board had the authority to stop them. Karen's little kingdom of power ended at ground level. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found Mike's number. My hands were shaking as I dialed, knowing that this was probably my only chance to save Sarah's life. If Mike could not help me, or if his company could not respond quickly enough, my wife might die in our front yard while Karen continued her power trip. The phone rang twice before Mike answered. His voice sounded professional and alert, like he was used to taking emergency calls at any time of day. "Mike, this is Tom Richardson from the Army. I need your help with a medical emergency that normal ambulance services cannot reach. My wife is dying and someone is blocking the ambulance. Can you get a helicopter to my location immediately?" I could hear him typing on a computer as I explained the situation. Time was running out, and this conversation would determine whether Sarah lived or died. Mike listened carefully as I explained the impossible situation unfolding in our front yard. I could hear him typing rapidly on his computer, pulling up maps and flight schedules while I talked. "Tom, that sounds like a nightmare situation," he said. "Give me your exact address and I'll see what we can do. We have a medical helicopter about 15 minutes out from your location that just finished another transport." I rattled off our address while watching Karen continue her bureaucratic circus with the growing crowd of HOA board members. They were now discussing the proper procedures for filing violations against both me and the ambulance crew. My wife was dying 20 feet away from them, and they were talking about paperwork. "Mike, I need you to understand how serious this is," I said. "My wife has been unconscious for almost 30 minutes and her breathing is getting worse. These people are not going to move no matter what anyone says to them." "I understand completely," Mike replied. "Let me talk to our pilot and medical crew. This is exactly the kind of situation where air medical transport makes sense. We can land in your backyard and bypass their roadblock entirely." The relief in my voice was obvious when I thanked him. "Mike, if you can make this happen, I will owe you for the rest of my life." "Don't worry about that right now. Just focus on your wife and get ready to guide our crew to her location when we arrive. I'm dispatching the helicopter immediately. Our flight time to your address should be about 12 minutes." While I was on the phone, the paramedics had tried one more time to reason with Karen and her board members. They explained federal emergency medical regulations and the legal liability the HOA was creating by obstructing medical care. Karen responded by threatening to file complaints against their licenses and demanding to speak with their supervisor. I walked back over to Sarah and knelt beside her again. Her condition had not improved, and I was starting to see signs that worried me even more. Her skin was getting paler, and her pulse felt even weaker than before. Every minute of delay was potentially causing permanent damage to her health. Mrs. Henderson came over and sat down beside me. "Tom, I called my daughter, who is a nurse. She said that the symptoms you described could be a heart attack or stroke. Either way, Sarah needs to get to a hospital immediately." I nodded and squeezed Sarah's hand gently. "Help is coming, Mrs. Henderson. I called in some special resources that these HOA people cannot stop." About 8 minutes later, we started hearing a distant sound that made everyone in the neighborhood look up at the sky. The distinctive whoop 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 of helicopter rotors was getting louder and closer. Karen was still lecturing the paramedics about proper procedures when the sound became impossible to ignore. The helicopter appeared over the tree line and began circling our neighborhood to identify the landing zone. It was a bright red medical helicopter with official markings and emergency lights flashing. The sound was getting louder as it prepared to land somewhere nearby. Karen stopped talking mid-sentence and looked up at the aircraft with confusion and growing alarm. "What is that helicopter doing here? Nobody authorized any aircraft to enter our airspace." I stood up and smiled for the first time in over an hour. "Karen, meet Federal Aviation Authority. Your HOA bylaws do not apply to aircraft operating under emergency medical protocols." The helicopter began its descent toward our backyard, which was large enough to accommodate the landing. The rotor wash started blowing dust and leaves around as the pilot expertly maneuvered the aircraft into position. All the neighbors came out of their houses to watch this unprecedented scene in our quiet suburban neighborhood. Karen pulled out her phone and started taking pictures of the helicopter. "This is completely unauthorized. I'm documenting this violation for our legal team. No aircraft have permission to land on HOA property." The pilot's voice came through a loudspeaker as the helicopter touched down. "This is a federal medical emergency operation. Please stay clear of the aircraft and medical personnel." Karen marched toward the helicopter with her portfolio in hand, apparently believing that her HOA authority extended to federal aviation operations. She was about to discover just how wrong she was about the limits of her power. The medical helicopter touched down in our backyard with professional precision. Two flight medics jumped out immediately and ran toward where Sarah was lying unconscious. They carried advanced medical equipment, and moved with the kind of urgency that the situation actually deserved. But Karen was not finished with her power trip. She followed the medical crew across our yard, shouting at them through the noise of the helicopter rotors. "Excuse me, you do not have authorization to land on HOA property. I demand to see your permits for this aircraft operation." The lead flight medic, a woman in her 30s with short blonde hair, glanced at Karen with disbelief before focusing on Sarah. She immediately began checking vital signs and preparing medical equipment while her partner set up an IV line. "Ma'am, we're conducting a federal medical emergency operation," the medic called back to Karen. "Please step back and let us do our job." Karen was not satisfied with that response. She actually stepped closer to the medical crew and tried to physically insert herself between them and my wife. "I don't care what kind of operation you think you're conducting. This is private property and you're trespassing without proper documentation." The helicopter pilot, who had remained at the controls, spoke through the aircraft's loudspeaker system. "Ma'am, federal emergency medical protocols supersede all local regulations. Please move away from the medical personnel immediately." Karen's face was turning red with rage as she realized that her usual tactics were not working. She pulled out her phone and started recording the medical crew while they worked on Sarah. "I am documenting this entire violation for our legal team," she announced loudly. "Every person involved in this unauthorized operation will face legal consequences." The second flight medic, a tall man with a calm demeanor, tried to reason with her while continuing his medical assessment. "Ma'am, your wife is in critical condition. We need to transport her to a trauma center immediately. Time is critical here." "She's not my wife," Karen screamed. "And I don't care about her condition. Rules are rules and nobody gets special treatment in this neighborhood." That statement made several neighbors gasp audibly. Mrs. Henderson looked shocked that anyone could be so callous about human life. Even some of the other HOA board members seemed uncomfortable with Karen's extreme reaction. But Karen was just getting started with her meltdown. As the flight medics prepared to move Sarah onto a stretcher, Karen demanded to speak to the helicopter's manager. "I want to talk to whoever is in charge of this aircraft right now. Someone needs to explain why you think you can violate our community standards." The pilot shut down the helicopter engines and climbed out of the cockpit. He was a veteran pilot in his 50s who clearly had experience dealing with difficult situations. He walked over to Karen with a patient but firm expression. "Ma'am, I'm the pilot in command of this aircraft. We're operating under federal emergency medical authority. Your local bylaws have no jurisdiction over our operation." Karen waved her portfolio at him like a weapon. "That's what you think. I have legal documentation that proves this entire property is under HOA governance. You're trespassing and I'm calling the police." She actually did call the police while the medical crew loaded Sarah into the helicopter. Within minutes, 2 patrol cars arrived with lights and sirens, responding to Karen's complaint about unauthorized aircraft operations. But when the police officers saw what was actually happening, their attitude changed completely. They realized they were looking at a legitimate medical emergency being obstructed by a neighborhood busybody who had lost all perspective. "Ma'am, we received a call about unauthorized aircraft, but this appears to be a medical helicopter responding to an emergency," one of the officers said to Karen. "Exactly," Karen replied. "They don't have proper permits and they're violating our community regulations." By this time, several neighbors had started recording Karen's behavior on their phones. Her meltdown was being captured from multiple angles as she ranted about permits and regulations, while medical professionals tried to save someone's life. The police officers quickly realized they were dealing with someone who had completely lost touch with reality. One of them approached me to get the actual facts about what was happening, while the other tried to calm Karen down and move her away from the medical operation. Karen's authority complex was crumbling in real time as actual authorities took control of the situation. The flight medics worked with incredible efficiency as they prepared Sarah for transport. They had her connected to advanced monitoring equipment within minutes and were communicating with the trauma center about her condition. Their professional competence stood in stark contrast to the chaos Karen had created. We're seeing signs of cardiac distress that could have been caused by a heart attack or severe arrhythmia, the lead medic explained to me. The delay in getting medical attention could have been very dangerous, but we're going to get her to specialists who can help. I climbed into the helicopter alongside Sarah as the crew prepared for takeoff. Looking down at Karen from the aircraft, I could see her still arguing with the police officers about permits and violations. She seemed completely oblivious to the fact that her obstruction could have killed someone. The flight to the regional trauma center took only 8 minutes, compared to the 40-minute ambulance ride that Karen had prevented. During the flight, the medical crew was able to administer advanced cardiac medications and stabilize Sarah's condition significantly. At the hospital, emergency room doctors immediately took over Sarah's care. After running extensive tests, they confirmed that she had suffered a severe cardiac episode that required immediate intervention. The cardiologist explained that the delay caused by Karen's obstruction could have resulted in permanent heart damage or death. "Your wife is very lucky that you found a way to get her here when you did," the doctor told me. "Another 30 minutes without treatment could have been fatal or caused irreversible damage to her heart muscle." While Sarah was receiving treatment, I received several phone calls from neighbors updating me on the situation back home. The police were still questioning Karen about obstructing emergency medical services, and her behavior had only gotten worse after we left. Apparently, Karen had demanded that the officers arrest the helicopter crew for trespassing. When they explained that medical helicopters have federal authority to land anywhere necessary for emergencies, she accused them of being part of a conspiracy against the HOA. Mrs. Henderson called to tell me that multiple neighbors had uploaded videos of Karen's meltdown to social media platforms. The footage showed her screaming at medical personnel while they tried to save Sarah's life, and the response from viewers was overwhelmingly negative. "Tom, I've never seen anything like it," Mrs. Henderson said. "People are calling her behavior completely heartless. The videos are being shared hundreds of times with comments about how terrible she was." Over the next few hours, while I waited for Sarah to recover from her medical procedures, I learned about the legal consequences that were piling up against Karen. The police had filed a report about her obstruction of emergency medical services, which was a serious criminal offense in our state. The helicopter company had also documented the incident thoroughly, including recordings of Karen's interference with their federal medical operation. Their legal team was considering filing charges related to obstruction of federal emergency responders. But the consequences went beyond criminal charges. The other HOA board members had called an emergency meeting to address the massive liability that Karen's actions had created for the entire association. Their insurance company was already asking questions about whether the HOA could be held responsible for Karen's individual actions. Several neighbors who had witnessed the incident were providing testimony to support our case against Karen. Even people who had been afraid to challenge her authority before were now speaking out about her completely inappropriate behavior. The hospital's social worker explained that we would need to document all the medical consequences of the delayed treatment for potential legal action. The extra time without medical care had caused additional stress to Sarah's heart that might have been avoided with immediate treatment. 2 days later, Sarah was released from the hospital with a full recovery expected. The doctors confirmed that the helicopter transport had likely saved her life and prevented permanent cardiac damage. Without that intervention, we might have had a very different outcome. When we returned home, I found that Karen was facing multiple legal challenges. The district attorney was considering criminal charges for obstruction of emergency services. The helicopter company was pursuing federal charges related to interfering with medical aircraft operations, and several neighbors were supporting a civil lawsuit against both Karen and the HOA for creating a dangerous situation. The videos of her meltdown had gone viral on social media, with hundreds of thousands of views and comments condemning her behavior. News outlets had picked up the story as an example of HOA power abuse taken to a dangerous extreme. Karen's moment of petty authority had created a legal and public relations nightmare that would follow her for years to come. 3 months after the helicopter incident, Sarah had made a complete recovery and was back to her normal activities. The cardiac specialists confirmed that the quick intervention had prevented any permanent damage to her heart. Every day I looked at my wife, I was reminded of how close we came to losing everything because of one person's power trip. Karen's legal troubles, however, were just beginning. The district attorney had filed criminal charges against her for obstruction of emergency medical services, a felony in our state that carried potential prison time. Her actions had endangered someone's life, and the legal system was treating it with the seriousness it deserved. The federal charges related to interfering with medical aircraft operations were even more serious. Federal prosecutors explained that obstructing emergency medical helicopters was considered a threat to aviation safety and public welfare. These charges carried mandatory minimum sentences and substantial fines. Karen had hired expensive lawyers to defend against the multiple legal cases, but the evidence against her was overwhelming. The videos recorded by neighbors showed her clearly obstructing medical personnel while they tried to save Sarah's life. Her own words, captured on multiple phones, demonstrated her complete disregard for human life in favor of bureaucratic power. The civil lawsuit was moving forward as well. Our attorney explained that Karen and potentially the HOA could be held financially responsible for the additional medical costs caused by her obstruction. The helicopter transport, extended hospital stay, and additional cardiac monitoring all resulted from her decision to block the ambulance. But the consequences went far beyond legal and financial penalties. The videos of Karen's meltdown had been viewed over 2 million times across various social media platforms. News outlets had covered the story as an example of HOA abuse taken to dangerous extremes. Karen had become the face of everything people hated about neighborhood busybodies and petty bureaucrats. The negative publicity had real-world consequences for Karen's life. Her employer, a local insurance company, had terminated her employment after the videos went viral. They explained that her behavior reflected poorly on their company values and customer service standards. Finding new employment became nearly impossible once potential employers searched her name online. The other HOA board members had voted unanimously to remove Karen from her position as president, and revoke her board membership entirely. They explained that her actions had created massive legal liability for the association and destroyed community trust in HOA leadership. The insurance company that covered our HOA had also taken action. They informed the board that Karen's individual actions might not be covered under their policy, leaving her personally responsible for any judgments or settlements. This meant she could face financial ruin if the civil lawsuits were successful. More importantly, the entire incident had led to positive changes in our community. The new HOA board implemented emergency protocols that specifically prohibited any interference with medical, fire, or police responses. They created clear guidelines that emergency situations automatically superseded all other community regulations. Several neighbors who had been intimidated by Karen's previous behavior started speaking out about other instances of her abuse of power. Stories emerged about elderly residents being harassed over minor violations, families being threatened with fines for children's toys in yards, and small business owners being driven away by excessive restrictions. The new HOA leadership worked to reverse many of Karen's most oppressive policies and create a more reasonable approach to community management. Property values actually increased as word spread that our neighborhood was no longer under the control of an authoritarian HOA board. Local news stations had followed up on our story several times, using it as an example of how HOA reform was needed across the region. Sarah and I were interviewed about our experience and the importance of prioritizing human welfare over bureaucratic power. The helicopter company that had saved Sarah's life also benefited from the positive publicity. They received recognition from medical organizations for their quick response and professional handling of a difficult situation. The pilot and medical crew were honored for their dedication to saving lives despite bureaucratic interference. 1 year later, Karen was sentenced to 18 months in prison for the criminal charges and ordered to pay substantial fines and restitution. The federal charges added additional prison time and ensured that her actions would have long-lasting consequences. But the most satisfying outcome was not Karen's punishment. It was the knowledge that no other family in our neighborhood would ever face the same kind of obstruction during a medical emergency. The new protocols and reformed HOA leadership meant that human life would always take priority over paperwork and permits. Sarah and I had learned that sometimes the system fails, and you have to find creative solutions to protect the people you love. The helicopter rescue had bypassed Karen's bureaucratic roadblock and saved my wife's life. Sometimes you have to rise above the petty tyrants and fly toward justice. Our neighborhood became a better place to live because one person's abuse of power was finally held accountable. Real change happened because people stood up and said that human decency matters more than bureaucratic control.